afternoon and welcome. I am Martha Minow. I am not the dean. But
you used to be the dean.
I did used to be the dean, as did you.
I used to be the dean.
And Dean Manning regrets so much not being here, but I'm sure you know the most important thing is family, and he's taking care of his family right now. And he wrote the questions. So
you would have written a different set of questions?
You might get a few slipped in.
Okay.
Justice Kagan, General Kagan, Dean Kagan, welcome back. Which is the best title?
You know, I like justice myself, but there was another dean of this law school who became Solicitor General before me, Dean Irwin Griswold Hall. He was dean for really a long time, puts us to shame.
30 years.
30? I was going to say 20-something.
26.
20, okay, anyway. And then he became Solicitor General later, and when he was Solicitor General, he insisted everybody, mostly people in the office and in the department, just call you by your first name, but to the extent that people use a title, they say General. And, but he insisted on being called Dean Griswold, even while he was Solicitor General. So,
wow.
So he said that was the best title, and he wasn't giving it up, but I don't really agree. It's a good title, you know, I liked it. I loved being Dean.
Yes, and you were fabulous Dean. If this year you find free coffee and free hot chocolate, something that you're grateful for.
What did you mean if?
It'll be there.
Okay.
It'll be there.
It's good to know my achievements are not being undermined.
Isn't it true that you were given, as the junior justice, which you were for several years, cafeteria duty?
I was. So
at the Supreme Court, and so what did you do there?
Not as well. Yeah. So the junior justice, for, you know, it's a very hierarchical institution. There's the Chief Justice, and then everybody gets ranked according to the level of seniority they have at the court, down to the most recent person. And I was the junior justice for 7 years before Justice Gorsuch came on. So that's a pretty lengthy time to be the junior justice. And they haze you while you're the junior justice.
In what way?
Yeah, they have these rituals. So I think that there are a few of them. I mean, one of them, which is okay, is that you have to take notes for everybody in conference, because our conference, which is where we discuss cases, is just the 9 of us. No clerks, no court personnel of any kind, and
no Alexa devices.
No Alexa devices, no laptops. Yeah, it's just like pen and paper and the justices. And somebody has to record what our decisions are, you know, which cases we've decided to take, which cases we've decided to hold, which case, you know, whatever it is. Truth be told, the Chief Justice does a pretty good job of making sure that there are no mistakes made. But the tradition is that it's the junior justice's job to do all that. So that's one thing, but that's sort of the most substantive thing. The second thing is that at this same conference, you have to open the door. So it turns out it's this conference room, and then there are these double doors, you know. A single one is not enough. It's very secret, very sacrosanct. So there are these double doors, and nobody can come into the conference room. Nobody can even get within, I guess, a door of the conference room. And, but sometimes people need things. You know, some of my colleagues are a little bit forgetful. So they need their cup of coffee, which they forgot to bring, or they brought the wrong file, or they forgot to bring their reading glasses, or whatever it is. So they'll call from the room and order up whatever they need. And you might think that the person who needs something would get the door, right? But it turns out it's not. Only the junior justice. So about 5 years ago, I injured my foot, and I was walking around with one of those big boots, you know. Knock, knock. Everybody was just, you know, waiting for me to get the door. I could have been, you know, like limping to, you know, nope. So that's the second thing. The third thing is the one you said, is that you're put on the cafeteria committee. And this is really, it's like, I'm convinced of this, that you get onto the court and you kind of think you're hot stuff, right? Because you've just been promoted to this big thing and you've gotten through the confirmation process. And
No more job interviews ever.
no more job interviews ever. And you're a Supreme Court justice. And then they say, no, you're going to be, you think you're so hot, you're going to be on the cafeteria committee. and you go to these monthly meetings where literally you are sitting there discussing with other people, why is the chocolate chip cookie recipe been changed?
Precedent matters.
But when I was put on the cafeteria committee, when they told me, well, this is your first responsibility, I said, and goes back to the fact that we were both deans, I said, I do cafeterias.
You do.
You know?
You do.
Because that
Great
cafeteria there was kind of, I mean, it was
You
sort of
did
yours
it.
and sort of
the
mine.
pizza, all of it's yours.
So, but I don't think I did as good a job. And the Supreme Court cafeteria is not really, I don't think,
Frozen yogurt.
up to the standards of the Harvard Law School.
Frozen yogurt?
But I did put in a frozen yogurt machine. Yeah.
All right.
It was it was the analogy to providing free coffee, you know? I just realized little things count.
It's very true.
I still get thanked for the frozen yogurt machine.
Rightly
You would have think
so.
people would have forgotten that I was responsible for it, you know? But there's a lure now, so.
Justice Froyo. How many of you?
Yeah. I mean, some people like my majority opinions, and some people like my dissents, and some people really couldn't care less, and they just like the frozen yogurt in the cafeteria.
How many of you are 1Ls? Raise your hand. Whoa. How many are LLMs? All right.
How many of you are 2Ls and 3Ls, and why are you here?
I think they couldn't get in. All right. So for those of you for whom this is like your first week here, I am going to ask Justice Kagan a question you might have in mind, which is, do you remember being here for the first week? Do you remember what it was like to be a brand new student? What did you feel?
Vaguely.
Were you nervous? Were you excited?
1983. So what is that? Like 35 years ago, right? Something like that?
Yeah.
I kind of remember. Yes, I was excited, but yes, I was also nervous. I hadn't a clue of why I was here, really. I was like one of those law students. You know how people now tell everybody, you really have to think about whether you want to go to law school. You know, don't just do it because it's like the next thing, because you can't.
You don't like
You've
blood.
crossed out all your other options. You think it will.
You don't like math.
Yeah, well, keep your options open, and you can't think of anything else.
Right.
I went to law school to keep my options open, and because I couldn't think of anything else. I didn't really have a much better reason than that. So it was a good thing, because notwithstanding that I went to law school for all the wrong reasons. But when I got to law school, I loved it, really loved it.
But when you were at Oxford, you wrote something about the Supreme Court, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
a little
it
bit
was-
of parochial. There you are in another country, and you're writing about, yeah.
So you had it in your mind somewhere.
Yeah, no, I guess by that point I knew I was going there because I couldn't think of anything else. But you know, this is just to say it doesn't really, you know, even if you're one of these people who don't quite know what your passion is, or even like what you want this to lead to, or
Sure.
But first of all, there are a lot of you out there, and that was me. I hadn't the faintest idea what it would lead to, and I didn't quite know what I wanted from the experience. But when I got here, I mean, I was very lucky. I really loved it. I was sort of from the start, and that, of course, you know, I was still nervous, but you know, in these first few weeks or whatever. But I loved my classes, and I just felt, you know, I still didn't quite know where I wanted to go or what I wanted to do, but I loved the experience. I just thought that law was so much fun to think about.
Were you called on early?
I was really lucky. We had these bigger sections then. You know, what is it, about 75? Mm-hmm. It was almost double that, like 140. So you really felt like you were speaking to a crowd when you were called on. I was called on first the first person called on in my section. So first day, first class, first person. You know who called on me. It was a mentor of both of ours, a man named Abe Shays. And he had a very, very warm heart. But he could also be kind of gruff. He was like this gruff kind of guy. And so I was, a little bit petrified. But the thing about it is you get through it. Everybody gets through it. Nobody in the class is grading you. Your peers aren't doing it because they're just as anxious and nervous about doing it as you are in the moment.
And relieved that they weren't called on.
And the professor isn't because, he's calls on a zillion people over the course of the year, and what does he care? And so I think of course you're going to be nervous until the first time it happens. So I think you should pray for it to happen soon. And then I think maybe these people don't know, I became a very Socratic professor.
Extremely.
So basically I ran my class. I didn't really even accept very many volunteers. I just ran my class by calling on people, and then calling on another person, and then calling on another person.
Didn't Senator Tom Cotton say something to you recently about your class?
Yeah, although he was in a seminar, so that was a little bit different. So, but yeah, he was a good student, and he said he said
you were awesome.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, I don't know if he really was. I wouldn't put words on his mouth. We liked each other. We had a good student-teacher rapport. But I think it teaches you a lot, because I think this law school thing, from almost all of you, it's just a new world. It's a new language to learn. It's a new set of concepts. It's a new way of thinking. Sort of this business of how to think like a lawyer, which is what first year is all about. But it's also about how to speak like a lawyer. And you don't do that unless you kind of practice it. It's just like anything else in the world. And so I think it's a really good thing for people to, be put in a position where they have to do this thing. They have to start speaking law talk. And that's the way you learn to do it.
You don't learn to play basketball by reading the rules.
Right. That's a good analogy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So how did you learn to be a good law student, and what advice do you have to both the JD and LLM students about, making it here?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is I did have to learn to be a good law student. I mean, there are some people here who will just get it naturally, and it's from the first day they just figure it out. And I wasn't one of those people. If I didn't tell you this story,
I will.
Some number of your first-year teachers are going to tell you this story, because it's kind of become, I think, at least it used to be, sort of part of the lore.
Yes, it's true.
Of what you tell first years when they're fretting about, how do I do this, and when are exams and stuff like that. But I didn't do it all well on my first set of law school exams. I was bottom third of the class, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is finally the place that has exposed me for the fraud that I am. And I said, because I had gotten through some pretty good schools,
Princeton,
and
Oxford, not bad.
and then it was oh boy. And I was very lucky, actually. I was very lucky because a professor of mine, who was my torts professor, when faculty members grade exams, they get back a list of what they've given everybody. And I walked to my mailbox, and there was a note from this torts professor, and he just said, "Come to my office." And I went to he really felt like, really? I got these bad grades, and now I have to go to his office and talk about them, But he was absolutely fantastic. He said to me, you're not a B- student, you're an A student, and You just have to figure out how to be that. And I'm not quite sure exactly what happened, but I think that the confidence that he had was really important. And I think I did a better job of, I talked to some people who had done really well and tried to figure out what they had done, and just kept on working hard is, I think, mostly the important thing. Not sort of saying, oh, I can't do this, but just saying, I'm going to keep trying to do this. And then things,
Worked out
things
okay.
turned around very nicely.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. A little bit of advice is show your work. Don't skip steps. Just, demonstrate that you're thinking it through. What did you least enjoy about law school?
Boy, that would be a hard one for me, because I really did just, love the 3 years. I loved my classes. I loved my extracurricular activities.
All right, I'll
I don't
move
know.
on.
All right. What did you least enjoy about law school? Give me a...
Oh, tax.
Tax. No, tax is great. Are you kidding me? Tax is fantastic. I look at all these transcripts now, actually, from students, when I'm picking clerks. And I'm like, why isn't anybody taking tax?
No, tax.
That's terrible. Tax is like where... I think law is good for... this is why I love thinking about law, because I love two parts of it. One part is like you really get to do stuff that matters to people and that means something for people. And, to live in a rule of law country is an incredible thing and has to be guarded and very carefully. And you're now part of that enterprise. And you should feel privileged to be part, but feel like there's a responsibility, there's a privilege, but it's also great. It's it's a mission, it's a goal, it gives you purpose and meaning in your life, no matter what part of the profession you're in. So that's one part of why I loved thinking about law and thinking about what I could do with it. But the other part that I loved was it's kind of like a game, I mean, it's like if you like word games or puzzles or, a lot of law school is like that too. It's like just trying to fit the pieces together.
Mental aerobics.
Mental
Yes.
aerobics, and using the sort of analytical part of you, and I loved that as well. And so tax was great because it was so complicated, and you had to fit it all together, and you had to make it work, and it was just like, doing a Rubik's Cube or something.
Okay, I have to redeem myself. So we both had the great honor of clerking for Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was often given tax opinions to work on.
Yeah, I'm not sure he loved that so much.
Yes, but I that's when I learned to love tax.
Uh-huh.
And even ERISA. So there you go. When you were in law school...
Justice Ginsburg's late husband, was a great
Fabulous.
tax lawyer,
Also graduate of this school.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, that's right. And so she loves tax by osmosis, just because, yeah, she feels like she has to love tax as part of her, yeah.
There's a feature film out about a case, a true
That
case.
they did together.
That they did together, which
Yeah.
was a tax case.
Yeah.
Did you ever imagine or hope that you would be a judge, or was this just accidental?
I think it was mostly accidental.
I think it was.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there was
I've known you a long time. I think it was accidental.
Yeah, maybe there was some time early on. But, so my life has taken pretty unusual path. This is the longest I've ever had a job by a good bit. I'm going into my 10th year.
Yeah.
I think before that, the longest job I ever had was when I was dean, and that was only 6 years. And other than that, it was a series of 4-year stints. Yeah. So I've jumped around a lot in my life. And I sort of, there are lawyers who they just find what they want to do and what they love to do, and they do that for the rest of their lives, and they're happy and fulfilled by doing that for the rest of their lives, and that's a fantastic thing. Myself, I'm more a dilettante, short attention. You're supposed to laugh at that, short attention span. But I've done a lot of things, and
Otherwise known as promotions, speedy promotions.
and you know, and not all of them pointed to being a judge. In fact, probably, you know, except for the SG's job, none of them pointed to being a judge. And until, you know, I would say until President Obama nominated me to be Solicitor General, you know, I guess what I thought was I was actually going to leave the law entirely. I mean, I was, like you were, dean of the law school. And unlike you, I thought, you know, I thought my next job would probably continue to be in academic administration, but I would like go on to be a president of a university or something like that. And so I guess what I really expected was that I was going to leave the law entirely. And then, you know, life is funny. It's all kinds of serendipity. And President Obama called me and offered me the SG's job. And at that point, you're kind of a little bit geared towards the court and thinking about that.
Yes. When you have crossroad moments like that, you know, when you're a professor at the University of Chicago and Abner Mikva calls you up and says, would you like to join me and be at the White House counsel's office? Or, you know, when you were called to go be SG, how do you think about that? Or how do you think about going after a job? Or what kind of advice and what went through your mind and what would you advise other people?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess what I think, and, you know, this is based on my experience, so it might not be true for everybody, but I do think that there's a lot of luck and a lot of serendipity in the way people's careers happen. And mostly you just, like, if you just have to look out for that, you know? I mean, it doesn't kind of come and conk you in the head. You have to sort of be aware of opportunities, although, you know, sometimes it does. When Judge Mikva called me and sort of said, come to the White House, which was, you know, very important in terms of the skills that I developed there over 4 years and the people I met. And, you know, if I hadn't done that, there's no way I'd be doing what I'm doing now, honestly. And, but I think you just sort of like have to look around you and be open to opportunities, even though you don't really expect them. I sometimes used to think when I was dean that our students, they plan everything. You know, it's like, here I am, and I'm going to go through law school, and I'm going to do this in my second summer, and this in my first summer, and then my first job is going to be this, and then that will lead to this. And in my experience, life doesn't really work that way. I mean, I'm not saying don't plan. It's good to have a sense of where you want to go and the kinds of things that you want to do. But it's also good to be able to completely abandon what your plans are and to do something that just seems fun and exciting and interesting in the moment, even though you're not quite sure where it will lead and even though you didn't really expect it.
Right.
And it, you know, it feels a little bit scary sometimes, and sometimes it involves a degree of risk-taking. Like if I do this, I'm off my plan, and I don't know where that goes, and maybe I won't be able to get back to my plan. And sometimes you won't be able to get back to your plan, you know? But I guess my view is that you should sort of always keep an eye out for exciting new things, and you know, not be afraid to abandon old plans and not be afraid to think of those plans from the get-go as really tentative.
And to realize that you know, you all will practice law or go into government or go into business or do kinds of work that we can't imagine right now. And so just to be open to those opportunities, I think that's absolutely right. But that does make me think a little bit about oral argument. So
really? Why?
Yeah. So here
what's the connection?
So what the connection is you have your plan. This is what I'm going to say, and then these people, these judges, these justices interrupt, and they have questions. And so how should you think about that? And when you were preparing for argument as Solicitor General, how did you think about it? And now that you've been on the other side, what advice would you give people if they're arguing in court?
Yeah, you shouldn't have too much of a plan. You should know what your first 2 or 3 sentences are going to be. Maybe your first paragraph, but probably you won't get to say them. Maybe you won't get anything past the first couple of sentences. And you should know what the big points that you want to make are, so that wherever the judges take you, you can figure out how to get back to and how to emphasize the real points that you want in people's heads when the argument is done. But after that, I think that the most successful lawyers at the court understand that it's not their show, it's the justice's show. And that's true just as a factual matter. But it's true because it's the judges who are making the decision, and they're going to make the decision based on the questions they have, not on the talking points that the lawyers have.
Right.
And the lawyers who are most successful are the lawyers who understand that the most important thing is to listen carefully to what seems to be hanging up the judges, what seems to be, what the justice's problems are with the position that the lawyer is arguing. So to figure out where your problems are, and then to answer them, and to answer them as fully as you can. A lot of less experienced lawyers, they'll get up there and they have their talking points, and when the judges ask them these really hard things, they don't want to be answering these really hard things because they're really hard. And they might not have the best answers to these things. They're the hardest parts of their case, right? But if you run away from those, back to your talking points, then you leave the justices with nothing. And the justices say, she doesn't have an answer to that. Right. So I think the most important thing is to listen really well and to be responsive.
And to see the question not as an interruption with your argument.
Right. It's the whole point of everybody being there,
yes.
Honestly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think, when I say that, I do think that that's, and a lot, sometimes people get the sense in law school, and this goes back to the cold calling, that it's about learning to speak, and that's what I said, and that's really important, I think. But you can then think of to figure out what it means to be a good lawyer is to figure out how to talk well. How, even how to be glib, essentially. The best lawyers are the most glib people, and that's totally not true. That the best lawyers are usually the best listeners, and that's true in all kinds of different areas of law.
So you indicated what makes a good oral argument, and now you've talked about what's a good lawyer. You've seen a lot of lawyers in your life. You've worked with a lot of lawyers. You've taught a lot of lawyers. What do you think are the qualities that really make for great lawyering? Listening, puzzle making, what else?
Well, I don't think there's one answer to that question, because I think there are a lot of different kinds of lawyers in the world. And it turns out that the qualities that will make one, the best Supreme Court practitioner are not the qualities that will make somebody the best deal negotiator, maybe, or the best counselor, which is an important role for a lawyer. And so, I think part of law school and part of not just law school, but the early to mid years of your career are sort of figuring out what your talents and skills are best suited to, and what you most enjoy, and putting yourself in the place where your talents and skills will really help you, and whatever weaknesses you have won't matter very much. So I don't think that there's any these three things are the things that you need to be a great lawyer, because maybe those three things will make you a great Supreme Court advocate, but not the things that will make you a great counselor. But I don't know. In general, listening well, being wise. Being smart is good, but being wise is even better. What do you think? What else?
Well, it's interesting. You've traveled around the world. I've traveled around the world, and I've heard people say, "I really want an American-style lawyer," and I've asked, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And they say, "I don't want someone to just tell me, here's what the rules are. I want someone who help me do what I want to do, given that those are what the rules are.
Yeah.
So I want a problem solver. And so
Does that mean that Americans whereas
Skirt the
everybody else
rules?
just say, no, you can't do that?
I hope that's not what it means. I hope that's not what it means, but I think it means, it's like my math teacher from 6th grade. There's more than one way to get there.
Yeah,
So a really good lawyer understands that there really are some no's,
yeah.
but there are also other paths.
That's for sure true. And, I'm thinking back to the time that I spent in government at the White House, where a large part of my job was to enforce the no's, but also to make sure that that my clients, even if it had to be a no as to the means, that the goals were served because you find another way.
Another way.
And those are the lawyers that people appreciate.
Absolutely.
But those are also the lawyers that that's what doing your job is you when you enforce the prohibitions, but you enable your clients to find ways to doing what they want to achieve their goals.
And so that's why being such a good listener is so important, because it's listening not just to what's said, but what's underneath. What are really the goals?
Yeah.
What are the purposes?
What do you really want?
Yeah, and asking that question. All right, everybody wants to know, so I'm going to ask. You have some new members of the court. Every time there's a new member, it's like a new member of the family. It changes things. What's changed?
Yeah, so this is what everybody always says. It's like a new court every time somebody new comes on. And because I was the junior justice for 7 years, for a long time I had basically no idea what that meant. And I guess now I have a much better idea, and it makes me look back and think that when I came on, I should have been actually more aware that all my colleagues were like, whoa, this is a new court. And not necessarily because Elena Kagan was sitting there, but because John Stevens was not sitting there. I took John Stevens' place, and John Stevens had been there for 35 years, and he was the senior associate justice, and he was, for all my colleagues, such an, and as you know, he passed away very recently. He was a great justice, and he was such an integral, wise and a good listener, but he was such an integral part of the court, and I think people was like, I don't even know what this institution is without him, and I wish I had been a little bit more aware of that. And I don't think it occurred to me in quite the way it should have. But similarly here, we've now had 2 changes. And I think, honestly, the changes are more in who's not there. I have 2, new colleagues, and they're both terrific members of the court, and, they're smart and... But if I really have to say the change, it doesn't have all that much to do with either of them. It has to do with Justice Scalia and Justice Kennedy not being there, and the change that makes to the decision making, but the change that it makes to the personal relationships and personal dynamic. So I miss them both enormously. Justice Kennedy is still around the building, and that's a really nice thing. But I think that when people, the last 3 substitutions have been not just kind of any old justice, but of justices who were truly major figures in terms of the number of years that they had been there, and in terms of their influence on the way the institution decided things, and influence on the way people thought about what they were doing. And, other than the Chief Justice, you would have to say that each of them was, sort of a crux of the court.
So Justice Scalia in particular and you were good friends, even though you disagreed a lot.
Yeah.
So how can you be a good friend with someone with whom you disagree a lot?
I think pretty easily, honestly. Maybe in that case it was made a little bit easier by the fact that we had a relationship before we started disagreeing a lot, or at least, You knew
him already, and
I knew him because I was dean of this law school.
Yes.
And Justice Scalia was a very loyal alumnus of this law school, and he came to various events at the school, and we honored him in various ways. He did the law school the great honor of asking, at a certain point in time, you get your portrait taken as a justice, or painted, but the court won't put it up until, I'm not sure what it is, until you've left or until you've died.
Right.
And so you have to find another place for your portrait. And
A storage facility.
yeah, but Justice Scalia called me one day and he said, would you put the portrait up in the law school? So we had this great event where we hung the portrait up in Langdale. And so I knew him, and we were personal friends before we started like arguing with each other about law. But honestly, I mean, he was warm and generous and funny and totally human. When I first joined the court, I went to him with a pretty strange request, and I've told the story a lot of times before, but during my confirmation proceedings, everybody wanted to know what I thought about gun rights. That was like the main question that I got from senators of both parties during my confirmation hearings. And because they can't ask you, like, well, what do you think of Heller, and they try to find proxy ways of asking these questions and I got a lot of questions about, have you ever been hunted? Do you know anybody who hunts? Do any of your relatives hunt? And I grew up in the middle of New York City. And, this is not what we did on the weekends. And so I'm sitting there with one of the senators from Idaho who had a ranch, and he was telling me about hunting and how important this was to his constituents, and the whole idea of gun culture, and how he was afraid that I was never really going to understand this. And I said to him, Senator, it's true that my personal experiences have not really led me this way. I said, but if you would like to take me hunting, I would love to go. And this look of abject horror came over his face, like, and I sort of realized I had probably gone a little bit too far, and I said, well, you don't really have to invite me hunting. I said, but I'll tell you what, I'll make a promise to you. If I'm lucky enough to be confirmed, I'll ask Justice Scalia, who I knew to be a very avid hunter, to take me. And so when I got on the court, I went to Justice Scalia, and I told him this story, and he thought it was the funniest thing that he had ever heard. And he said, all right. And he said, he took me to his gun club, and he taught me to shoot, and he taught me about gun safety, and then he started taking me out with all his buddies, and we shot lots of birds together, and we shot ducks, and once we went to Wyoming to shoot antelope, and
Not Bambi.
and anyway, this is just to say, he was just like a person, and he was so much fun.
Yeah.
And, besides that, I loved kind of talking about law with Justice Scalia. I mean, sometimes he infuriated me, just as I'm sure that sometimes I infuriated him. But he was so smart and so engaged and so interested in everything, and he thought that the job was so much fun. I mean, I remember walking out of conference one day, and he said, and it was like my first year, and he said, isn't this the greatest job? And I thought, that's the right attitude to have. It's like, every case, every day, this is just the greatest job to be able to think about these things. So I think you grow up and you learn that you can be friends with lots of people who have lots of different opinions. Sometimes you're not going to be friends with the people who have the same opinions. Let's be frank, just in fact that somebody agrees with you is not necessarily going to make them your best friend.
Yeah.
And it works the other way too.
So, and there's a lot of relevance to what happens in law school. So,
I think there is, I do, because maybe some people come in with this sense of, it's like us and them, and it shouldn't be that way. I mean, I think you only learn by talking to people who have different views than you have, and and think different thoughts. And echo chambers are kind of boring. And it's like you already know what you think, and so like why surround yourself with people who think exactly what you think? The mind expanding part of law school is to surround yourself with people who think differently from you, and to try to figure out why they think that way, and to be open to changing your mind sometimes, and to have the experience of changing their mind sometimes.
You were a great reader. You love fiction. You love nonfiction. One of the great things about fiction is you can imagine your way into another world. And that's true about an argument with someone with whom you disagree. You can begin to imagine, oh, if you think about the world that way, that's maybe why.
Right. And I think about this all the time because, I have a job which, if you're going to be, you want to try to persuade people. And that's a very hard thing to do.
Yeah.
It's hard to persuade anybody of anything, honestly. But it's here they are. They're Supreme Court justices. They've been very successful in their lives. They've gotten there for a reason. They know what they think. They have some pretty core convictions.
Mm-hmm.
But still, to the extent that sometimes you need to persuade somebody. And so how do you do that? And sometimes you don't do it, you fail. But to the extent that you do it, it's because you're able to see the world from their point of view, to step into their shoes, and to say, like, if I thought all these things, what would make me join, this position with respect to this case? And I think you can't really figure out at all how to persuade somebody on a particular issue unless you have a sense of the way they see the world.
Do you agree with our colleague Cass Sunstein that the best way to deal with disagreement across the court is to have minimal decisions, to decide narrowly?
Well, I don't think you can say across the board, but I think that there's a lot to that in a lot of cases. And so just as an example, when Justice Scalia died, and we were an 8-member court for the better part of 2 terms, both the term in which he passed away and then the next term until he was replaced. So for the better part of 2 terms, we had to do a lot of decision-making as an 8-person court. And none of us wanted it to seem as though the court couldn't function that way. But none of us wanted to have a lot of 4-4 decisions where we were just punting everything back.
Yeah.
So we tried really hard, even in cases where we really were sort of 4-4.
4-4 leaves in place the decision below.
4-4 leaves in place the decision below. It essentially says we can't deal with this. It's just going to be whatever the lower court did. And there were sometimes where we really were 4-4. Yeah. And so what did we do? And we kept talking, and we kept trying to find a way to bring over more people. And I think what I learned from doing that was that mostly the way you do that is not to just keep on making the same points that the 4 others have just, but is to reframe the case and to make it smaller and to find the area of agreement rather than to keep bashing at each other on the areas of disagreement. And in most issues, the higher up you go and the bigger the issues are, the more disagreement you create. And then smaller issues you can often find consensus on. So we did. We tried to make cases small. Now, sometimes that worked, and we did something useful and terrific, and we showed that the court could function as an institution with consensus. And sometimes it's a little bit ridiculous, right? Because nobody cares about the little issue, right? They want to, the important question. It's not why the case is there. It's not what lower courts disagreed about. And the little issue is just, you can solve it, but it's only a kind of temporizing solution. And it's, but not always. And so I think that was good actually for all of the members of the court who engaged in that process, because it showed you how you, if you wanted to, and you can do the same thing in a 9-member court, how if you wanted you could create broader consensuses.
Do you think that the court is not working hard enough? Now, that sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but you're taking about half as many cases as when you were a law clerk,
Yeah.
right? It's about 70 cases a
Yeah,
year?
you know, as I look out at this audience, there are a few of my old clerks in the audience because they're now teaching here.
Yes.
And they will know that sometimes, I try not to do this all the time, but sometimes I did fall into this kind of like, you don't know how lucky you are. This sort of like,
We had to trudge through snow.
when I was a girl, right, I walked 20 miles to school barefoot, except you know, what it was, and it was true.
It's true.
We did, the years that we clerked, 140 cases, 150
Easily.
cases,
Yeah.
and now we do about half that. But I would tell you, I work plenty hard. So, you know, a bunch of us, I think that we could take some number more cases, 10 or 20 or something like that. I think nobody wants to go back to 140. I think that was actually fairly insane.
Yeah.
And I think that at least for me, I can't speak for my colleagues, at least for me, I couldn't do the job in the way I do the job if we had twice as many cases. And, you know, I would not know the cases as well. I would not take the, I would not be able to spend the time I take writing opinions. I would leave more stuff to my clerks. You know, so you know, I think I could increase by some number.
Right.
So it's not like we're putting an arbitrary cap on it. But I wouldn't go back up to 140. But I think what's the interesting thing, and I don't know why this is, but I mean, all of us actually, we start the year and we go, oh, let's take more cases. And then we just don't end up taking more cases. The cases,
It's essentially discretionary.
given our
docket.
usual criteria for when cases ought to be taken,
Yeah.
they just aren't 140 cases anymore.
Well, in many ways, your court is not a dispute resolution court. You are a law-declaring, law-reinforcing court, and you're sending signals out, not just to other courts, but to actors out there in the world.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would use exactly those labels, but we're for sure not an error correction court. I mean, one way that you could increase the caseload of the court is if the court just looked around at petitions and said, oh, they got that wrong, they got that wrong, they got that wrong. And that's, for the most part, not the way we conceive of the job. That, you know, if it is unfortunately the case that there are some errors in the judicial system, and but what the court's job is, and it is not to correct the last of the errors. It's really to decide on either more important, like systemically important legal questions. Everything's important to particular people, but systemically important legal questions. Or very often, I mean, sometimes people say, why in the world is the Supreme Court doing this case or that case, which seems kind of technical and arcane and maybe boring and maybe not systemically important. And I think when that's true, it's almost always the case that we're doing it for uniformity purposes, that the real job of the court is to ensure that federal law is understood and applied uniformly across the country, so that we won't correct every mistake that a lower court makes, but if we see something where the First Circuit Court of Appeals, which is like where Massachusetts understands federal law differently from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is out on the West Coast, then we're going to take that case to say who got it right and to ensure that whether you live in California or you live in Massachusetts, you're subject to the same federal law.
Right. And there are other ways to correct errors sometimes in the Court of Appeals, there can be an en banc reconsideration, and the district court, there can be a reopening. So there are other ways, but that's exactly right. You're not there just to correct the errors. In the uniformity goal, I mean, you're now the justice given the assignment of the Ninth Circuit, right? And so it means you get to go to California periodically?
And many other states out there,
Yes,
So it's a very large circuit, many states.
And you previously were the Sixth Circuit?
Sixth and Seventh.
So is it different? Do you feel it's different?
I just took over the Ninth.
Yeah, so we'll see.
And there's a limited amount that the justice for a particular circuit does. But I will say that the Ninth Circuit, you go out every year to conferences, and there are more excellent conference locations in the Ninth Circuit. But really, the law part of it, is not all that different.
It is kind of remarkable to imagine the Constitution was drafted without those intermediate courts, and the justices would have to get on a horse and go hear cases, circuit, right? Yeah. So that would have been a long way in California.
In those days when we were doing the 140, 150 cases, there was a lot of talk, do you remember, about putting in another layer in between the circuit judges and the Supreme Court. But then the problem just sort of solved itself. They stopped taking cases.
Right. So you often have rated your colleagues in terms of who's the funniest?
No, I don't rate them. No, I think you're talking like John Manning always asks me when I'm here. There is a person who rates us.
That's true.
And you know how he does it? This person, I think he's a professor at BU.
Professor.
I'm sure he does serious academic work too, but he takes a transcript, and in the transcript, it will say, Chief Justice, da 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 da, and then it will say bracket, laughter. So he counts up the laughs. And when Justice Scalia was alive, Justice Scalia was always the funniest justice. So I think John, who was a clerk for Justice Scalia, wanted to know who was going to take Justice Scalia's place. And I said I predicted that Justice Breyer would, and Justice Breyer has. So every year, Justice Breyer is the funniest justice, as measured by the laughs in the Supreme Court transcript.
Do you try?
Do I try to be the funniest justice?
Yes.
I could not compete with Justice Breyer.
You're doing a good job.
Yeah, no. This guy who does this wrote someplace, I'm not sure he intended that I should see this, but he wrote that I was underperforming. Yeah, he was convinced that I was funny, maybe because he had seen me, but turns out I'm very much kind of like
underachiever,
lodged in the middle.
Now, you are often singled out for writing the most accessible and well-written opinions. So how do you write opinions, and who are you writing an opinion for?
Well, I think that there are a lot of people on the court who are really excellent writers, but who am I writing an opinion for? I guess I try to write my opinions for not just for legal specialists, and indeed not just for lawyers, but try to make sure that my opinions can be read by, interested citizens. And that doesn't, it's not going to be everybody. You can't dumb your opinions down, and these are often very complicated subject matter areas. And I hope that I don't ever gloss things over, but that I treat the complications with the respect that they're due. But at the same time, to try to figure out, how to convey to people what we're doing and why we're doing it. So I think about it, honestly, in the way that I used to think about teaching. So when I would come here and go to my office and think, let's say I'm teaching civil procedure, and think, okay, I'm teaching former adjudication today. And that's a complicated area.
It is.
And so I'm going to be looking out at 80 people who
have never heard of offensive non-mutual collateral estoppel.
Correct. and you know, they're smart and they've done some reading, but they basically don't know all that much, right? And so, you know, how are they going to learn it? And I would think about, okay, if like, how do you learn something? First, you have to tell them this, and then you have to make sure that they know that, and then you have to make sure that they know this. And in a way that both makes them understand in the moment, and also in a way that makes it stick, you know, because some ways of teaching, ideas become sticky. They stick in your head, and others, they go in one ear and go out the other. So I think what I learned when I was teaching about how to communicate complicated subject matter is what I try to bank on when I'm writing. And then the what did you call it? Informality or
Accessibility.
Accessibility. Yeah, well, I think that just comes from, like, if I want just ordinary people to understand things, I can't talk in a kind of legal jargony sort of way. And sometimes the best way to communicate ideas and the best way to make them stick is to use interesting language, and language that will, you know, form a picture in people's heads.
And maybe make a reference to Spider-Man now and then.
That was a case about a Spider-Man outfit. It was a case about one of these Spider-Man gloves that, you know, if you go like this, a web comes out. So, like, you had to talk about Spider-Man. It wasn't an accident that I was talking about Spider-Man.
And with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, so I didn't have to put in that, but, you know, it seemed appropriate.
I think so, and I think that everyone here wants to join me in thanking you for exercising your responsibility so well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.